channel. All of them are available in the description, along with the Telegram channel, which contains the names of all the stories. As usual, don't forget to support me with a like and a subscription. And let's begin the manhwa with the protagonist who was living a normal life. Ultimately, one day, he was exposed to a very difficult and strange accident. As soon as he opened his eyes, he transitioned to a completely different world. And so, he found himself in the body of a genius teacher at a famous magic academy named Valdam. This teacher's name was Chris, but Chris's joy didn't last. Whether it was luck or fate, this teacher had a fatal flaw. In this world, any living being can use magic, even monsters. But Chris turned out to be an illegal player, meaning he didn't have a single drop of magic in his body. To avoid being exposed and executed as a monster, he had only one solution, which was to play the role of the lazy teacher who pretends to be extremely powerful, hiding his true ability and genius, while motivating the genius students, whom he fooled and tricked. The entire academy was celebrating graduation day, and the ideal student among the graduates was being announced. Who was Michael Foxon? Michael confidently stepped up to give his speech, and at that moment, our protagonist Chris was watching him while sitting on a distant tree branch. He thought to himself that he couldn't believe this boy, who used to stammer and couldn't utter two coherent words, was now standing in front of everyone like this. My place here shows that these students develop fast. Chris said to himself, Michael has truly grown and become a beast, even though I didn't teach you anything useful and was just laughing at you. Chris thought that he had finished his mission and played his main role correctly for 3 years alongside the protagonist, and now the time had come for him to escape and live his life. But suddenly, Michael Foxon dropped a bombshell in front of everyone, saying, everything I have achieved is thanks to one person, my role model and mentor, teacher Chris. As soon as Chris heard this, he was shocked and wondered why his name was brought into this when he just wanted to escape. Michael continued speaking sincerely, saying that without his teacher, he wouldn't be the person standing before them today, thanking him for never giving up on him despite his weakness. He thanked him for knowing his purpose, and said that Chris must have his reasons for wanting to leave the academy. Therefore, he wanted a chance to return the favor and serve him for the rest of his life. Chris was in total disbelief, saying to himself, no, the protagonist's story is actually just beginning, and the whole world is waiting for him. He should know how many factions want to recruit him. But it didn't stop with Michael. Michael continued and said, it's not just me. Every classmate here who trained under his hands has gathered for one purpose, which is to follow Professor Chris Dutton. The 5 of them announced their full allegiance. Chris was terrified and shocked by what was happening, thinking, I'm just an ordinary person with no power, who doesn't even know how to cast a single spell. Have I raised their stats to this extent? Going back in time a little to the accident that happened to Chris, at the moment he was losing consciousness, a system screen suddenly appeared in front of him, showing a mission, through which he granted a wish for a new life. There was a mission button, and Chris at that moment was truly terrified of death. As soon as he saw the words new life, he realized he didn't want to die there, so he accepted the mission without hesitation. Chris then opened his eyes inside the story. He was startled to find a girl standing in front of him, happy that he had woken up, while he was confused by everything around him. When the girl called him by his name, the system screen appeared in front of him again and seen by the girl. Afterward, the girl handed him his identity card, informing him that he was a teacher at Valdam Academy. Chris looked at the card in disbelief. It indeed stated he was a new teacher, and he wondered how he could read this language when it wasn't his native tongue. The girl told him that today was supposed to be his first day, but due to the accident he had suffered, the academy accommodated his circumstances and delayed his starting date a bit. Chris asked her for a mirror, and at that moment, the status screen appeared before him again, welcoming him to this place as a new character, Chris Dutton, the new teacher at Valdam Academy. He had to spend the next 3 years executing missions as Chris. Chris then understood the game and realized that Valdam Academy was the very same one from the fantasy novel he used to read for entertainment. Titled The Demon King, the protagonist realized that he had now become part of this world. While he was still trying to process his new life, a system screen suddenly appeared, telling him that a teacher must have disciples. The mission now required him to reach the front gate of Valdam Academy within a specific time. The reward was a map of the academy. and the time limit was just half a day, ending on February 1st. But the real shock lay in the penalty. It stated that the penalty was absolute death. The moment he saw that word, he went mad, punching the system screen and screaming that he had just died and now it wanted to kill him again for failing, calling it incredibly cruel. Of course, the girl who was with him in the room was terrified, as she couldn't see the screen or understand who he was shouting at, thinking he was insane. She asked if he was okay, noting that he clearly needed to rest and that she didn't understand who he was talking to. The next day, Chris left the clinic, talking to himself about how the girl had discharged him early even though his body was aching from the accident. The biggest shock was that his life savings had vanished at the clinic, leaving him with absolutely no money. He realized his journey to the academy would require a half-day walk. Chris decided to try something he always wanted to do. He summoned the system screen to check his inventory. It was a massive shock. His reputation was 0, and his strength, speed, and defense were all rated F, the weakest tier. This meant his speed was incredibly slow, and his defense was weaker than a toddler's. Worse still, his skills section stated that he was an illegal player who couldn't use magic at all. Chris was devastated and began to scream because he had transferred to another world as a failure. He wondered how he could live a normal life here when anyone who cannot use magic in this world is considered a monster, especially since he is a teacher in the largest academy on the continent. Meaning this wasn't just a tough spot, it was a death sentence. Chris thought about fleeing, but the remaining time was only 23 minutes. He realized he had no choice but to play the role of Chris, the mysterious legendary figure who hides his true power because he is a grand persona. He remembered that back in his online gaming days, he was so good at role-playing that people used to report him because he was too convincing. So he decided to live the role for 3 full years to save his skin. He arrived at the gate of Valdam Academy and saw a statue shaped like a horned dragon monster. The statue seemed bored, but suddenly it felt a terrifying aura approaching, to the point where it began to sweat from fear. It saw Chris walking over, looking menacing, with a scar on his face, black hair like a monster, pale skin, and bloodshot eyes. The statue thought the Grim Reaper was approaching in human form, a true monster of terror, and wondered about this frightening energy. The monster asked for his name and purpose. Chris replied with absolute coldness and a villainous tone, telling him that he was the new teacher, Chris Dutton, and demanded he open the gate immediately. As soon as Chris stepped inside, he began to pant, saying he almost died of fright because that monster was terrifying. However, he began to craft the persona he would live by, the legendary unmotivated teacher. This meant appearing negligent to everyone and his students, while in reality, being a powerful warrior affected by a tragic past. He decided to prove this by acting arrogant with his students, telling them that they were unworthy of being taught by him, all to hide the fact that he possessed no magic. Suddenly, while lost in his thoughts, his scar began to bleed. It turned out the wound from the accident had reopened, and he started to feel dizzy as pain surged through his body. At that exact moment, the system screen opened again to congratulate him, stating that his mission was complete. He received a map of Valdam Academy as a reward. As soon as Chris saw this, he became furious and started shouting, saying he didn't need a map or anything of the sort. He needed something to heal his body, because in this condition, he couldn't even walk 2 steps back to the clinic. Suddenly, Chris felt someone behind him. He looked back to find a student asking if he was okay, noticing that he was bleeding from his head and looked exhausted. Chris stared at the student, inspecting him, and immediately recognized from the mark on his cheek that this was Michael Foxon, the original protagonist of the novel. But Michael right now was just a young boy, showing no signs of power, with blue hair, looking insecure and anxious. This was completely different from the legendary power he would possess later. Chris realized he had to stick to his plan and act like a detached, uncaring teacher. He asked coldly, "What brings you here? Don't you have a class right now?" Michael replied nervously, saying that the magic teacher told him to go back to basic training because he wasn't keeping up with his classmates, who were progressing rapidly. As soon as Chris heard this, he cursed the other teacher, calling him despicable. Michael mistakenly thought Chris was insulting him, so his eyes welled up with tears and he apologized. Chris was shocked, thinking to himself that he wasn't insulting him at all, and he didn't expect the boy to take the word so personally and cry, making the situation exhausting from the start. At that moment, the system displayed a new mission, informing Chris that on his first day at the academy, he had to teach Class X. He had to reach the classroom on time and deliver his first lesson. The reward was an artifact, along with the rest of the map. The penalty, of course, was certain death, and the remaining time was less than 10 minutes. Chris didn't know the way, so he utilized Michael, thinking to himself that the boy surely knew the path. Adopting a terrifying persona, Chris demanded that Michael show him the way to his classroom. Out of sheer terror, Michael agreed. But Michael was startled when Chris suddenly picked him up and began running with him at full speed, trying to reach the classroom to avoid dying. When they arrived, Chris set down Michael, who was practically dying of fear. Chris entered the classroom with immense dignity. The moment the students saw him, they fell completely silent, and the atmosphere grew incredibly tense. Chris walked over, stood before the desk, looked at them all with contempt, and said that each one of them was garbage, wondering if Valdam Academy had gone mad to make him teach such faces. The students began to whisper among themselves, wondering who this man covered in blood was. One of the prominent students, Nikat, raised his hand and asked who he was, noting that this area was restricted to unauthorized personnel. Chris replied with absolute confidence, telling him that he was Chris Dutton. Nikat remembered and said, "Oh, so this is the teacher who had an accident and was delayed." Chris demanded complete silence, shutting down their chatter, though internally he was deeply embarrassed about the accident. Chris realized he was in a tight spot because he knew nothing about magic or the basic elements, and the system hadn't provided any information. He decided to bypass the issue, grabbed a piece of chalk, and wrote in large letters on the board that they had self-study. After writing it, Chris walked over and sat on the chair with complete coldness, falling asleep. He felt deeply embarrassed, but told himself he had to be bold, showing them that they weren't even worth him explaining anything to them. The students were shocked, wondering if this was truly his first day, telling themselves that he must be a mad teacher. Suddenly, one of the female students stood up furiously, called out to Chris and asked if this was a joke, adding that if it was, it wasn't the time for it, especially since he hadn't even brought an educational receiver device, which is standard in the ancient Valdam Academy. The moment Chris heard the voice of the girl shouting at him, he immediately recognized her as Angelina, the main female-led candidate of the novel, often called the princess, who belonged to a ducal family. Everyone held her in high regard because most of the students came from wealthy families. To her, what Chris was doing was an unforgivable insult. In his mind, Chris was saying that he was very sorry and knew her situation was difficult and that she didn't like this setup, but he was Chris now and had to maintain the role. Chris looked at her coldly and said sharply, "If you don't like the situation, get out of the classroom right now." Angelina was shocked by his words. Chris continued, "Did you hear me or what? If you are not satisfied with my lesson, go to any other teacher." Internally, Chris was torn and apologizing to her, but Angelina was extremely angry. She stated that she had no intention of learning anything anyway. A person named Fox tried to calm her down, but she didn't listen to anyone, grabbed her things, and left quickly, saying she wouldn't waste her time with a useless teacher. Following her lead, most of the students in the classroom got up and left because they were nobles with high pride. Chris watched the situation unfold, thinking to himself that he had expected this, but wondered what he would do if he got fired now, as he had no one but the principal to turn to. Suddenly, the system opened before him, announcing that he had completed the mission, granting him the rest of the map and a monkey medal as a reward. Chris sighed with relief, noting that he had barely survived. He looked at the remaining students, who happened to be the actual main characters of the novel, sitting before him: Michael, the main protagonist; Nikat, the brilliant student; Tulsi from the protagonist's party; and Bella, the renowned genius healer, along with another girl from their group whom he didn't have much information about. Chris put on the face of a truly legendary teacher, stood up, and delivered a profound statement to the classroom, telling them that if teachers instruct them in magic without a conscience, people will die. As the students listened intently, he completed his thought, saying that Valdam Academy is a training ground for killers. When they place a lethal weapon in the hands of someone who doesn't understand their own power, it is not just they who will die, but they will cause the deaths of other innocent people who have nothing to do with the matter. Would you call that an accident or a mistake? Or is it just evading reality? Do you have the courage to carry such names? The entire classroom fell into a heavy, silent hush. Chris left them and walked out with great dignity. However, the moment he stepped outside, he leaned against the wall and began to laugh hysterically, realizing that he had just squeezed 10 years of life experience into those few words, and that acting this part was much harder than he had ever imagined. He looked at his reward, which was the monkey medal, thinking it looked very cute, though he noted that if anyone saw him with it, it would completely ruin his terrifying aura. As the system explained, this medal increases speed by an entire tier, but once worn, it cannot be removed for 5 minutes, pushing his speed to the absolute limit. Chris wore it under his clothes, and indeed, his speed shifted from F, which is equivalent to a snail's pace, to E, which is equivalent to a slightly larger snail. But the real shock came from its side effect. The system informed him that he now had to end his sentences with the sound K, like a monkey. Chris was furious, cursing the system and asking if it took him for a monkey, but he was startled to find himself uttering the word K involuntarily, exactly as the system demanded. Just then, he noticed a girl watching him from a distance, who turned out to be Angelina. The moment her eyes met his, she froze in fear. Chris wished he could use stealth magic, while Angelina was terrified by his gaze, which resembled that of the Grim Reaper. She assumed he had caught her smoking, so she said weakly, "You saw me smoking, didn't you? I know I am wrong and ready for any punishment," but she secretly wished he would expel her and declare her unfit to be her family's heir, so she could be free of her constraints and live liberated. However, Chris did something highly experienced to defuse the situation easily. He gently placed his hand on her head and said a single sentence, calling her a miserable child. Angelina stood frozen, reflecting on his words and wondering what he truly meant, as she couldn't fully comprehend the phrase. The look in his eyes wasn't one of anger or irritation. It was the look of someone who had seen immense pain and witnessed tragic endings before. It was as if he was telling her that trying to mask that pain with reckless behavior was short-sighted foolishness. Angelina continued to think, seeing Chris in a completely different light as a very strong figure, believing that the regret in his eyes showed he was a human with feelings, not just an ignorant, tyrannical teacher, as she had initially thought. She watched Chris walk away with the monkey medal dangling from him. Angelina found it very strange, noting that a monkey medal didn't fit his terrifying persona at all, concluding that he must have received it from someone dear to him, perhaps as a memory from the past that deeply affected him. She genuinely felt sorry for triggering something painful within him by acting childishly. Meanwhile, Chris was stressing over a completely different problem, thinking to himself that banning smoking during a massive war doesn't fit a legendary star persona at all, and that he had accidentally painted himself as a caring teacher. Furthermore, the girl had noticed him ending his sentences with K like a monkey. After a while, Angelina returned to the classroom, reclaiming her seat, which deeply surprised Chris. To mask her embarrassment, Angelina said coldly that no one should misunderstand her intentions, claiming she was merely curious to see Bella's unique healing magic. At that moment, Nikat was filled with immense enthusiasm, declaring that Class X now consisted of himself, Michael, Tulsi, Bella, and Angelina, making them a group of 5 elite youths, which he found incredibly exciting. Chris looked at them, knowing internally that all the other students had submitted transfer requests out of the class due to his harsh methods, leaving only the actual heroes. Angelina challenged the protagonist, wanting to show those who fled who they truly were, asking if she should take Michael's advice. The gentle girl replied, asking her to calm down and not disturb Michael. She added that the teacher was about to begin explaining the lesson. Chris stood up, preparing himself for the decisive moment, believing it was time for the first real class, even though he secretly wished he could flee, since he understood absolutely nothing. Looking at the students, he announced with great dignity that today's class would be a field training session. Suddenly, a new mission screen appeared before him, marking their first true tracking mission, requiring him to take Class X to Solfantis and defeat the monsters there. The reward was a third portion of the academy, like a sacred sword, with an unspecified time limit, while the penalty for failure was certain death. Chris then transitioned along with his students to a beautiful location. They realized they had arrived at Solfantis, where the field training would take place. Nikat was completely amazed, his eyes shining at how beautiful the place was, noting that they hadn't even brought their weapons because Chris had utilized teleportation magic to bring them here. In reality, Chris was terrified internally, wondering how they had suddenly moved from the classroom to this place without him doing anything. Realizing that the magic inherent to the location itself was something an ordinary person couldn't achieve. Suddenly, Tulsi noticed a strange shadow looming over Chris's head, causing them to realize that a third party had brought them here. Angelina screamed, warning Chris to look out because there was a boss monster behind him. Chris turned around, dying of fright inside, thinking he was about to meet his end as a massive horned rabbit stood before him, serving as the boss. The remaining time for his mission was 24 minutes, and Chris was supposed to eliminate all these monsters. However, Chris had not yet defeated any of the 50 required monsters. He tried to compose himself, wondering what a legendary teacher would do in such a situation. Viewing this as an opportunity to test the students, he shouted at them, asking if they were fools and if they had forgotten why they were here. Angelina was surprised, wondering if he was serious and truly wanting them to fight in this situation, certain that he could see what was behind them. Nikat saved the situation with his sharp intellect, understanding that the teacher intended to handle the boss himself while leaving the smaller monsters to them. Chris was overjoyed internally, praising the boy's cleverness as an ideal student who had successfully saved his dignified reputation. Following that, the students began to take action. Angelina gripped her spear and charged at the monster. Bella offered support to heal anyone who got injured, and Michael began to gather fire in his hand. Chris felt immensely proud of them, seeing that things were going well as the students successfully dealt with all the smaller monsters. However, Chris had forgotten a crucial detail, the giant wild rabbit boss that was still right behind him. Chris was struck with terror, realizing he had overlooked the monster's presence. Closing his eyes, he accepted his fate. He thought to himself that if he failed the mission, the system would kill him anyway, so he chose an easy death in battle. Suddenly, the monster lunged at Chris and devoured him right before their eyes. The moment Michael saw Chris get eaten, he experienced the shock of his life and began running to save him, crying out. He lamented that someone was dying in front of him again because he was weak and a failure, blaming himself entirely. Bella tried to hold him back, saying it was too late and that the professor had sacrificed himself for them. But Michael was completely devastated, remembering when Chris told him he had grown strong, recalling that Chris was the only one who truly believed in him. Michael continuously blamed himself, saying he was merely a burden on them and that he should have been the one eaten, not the teacher or his mother. Amidst his breakdown, a demonic voice surfaced inside Michael, offering him power if he accepted its hand so they could become one. The demon was on the verge of completely taking over Michael's mind when suddenly, the dark voice was cut short by someone saying, "Have you all stopped?" Chris appeared before them, completely drenched in blood, having emerged after killing the monster from the inside. He looked at them with immense dignity and asked why they were panicking, pointing out that they hadn't even noticed the monsters surrounding them and attacking. By doing this, he had killed 27 monsters out of 50, meaning the mission was halfway complete. Nikat was bursting with joy upon seeing Chris alive, and remarked with admiration that he had expected the delayed reaction. Assuming Chris intentionally let the monster eat him to destroy it from the inside, calling it the easiest method. Internally, Chris thought that this boy was incredibly sharp and that he didn't even need to invent excuses as long as Nikat was around. To maintain his persona, he replied sharply, telling him that he talked too much and should just watch, reminding them all that today was field training. Chris then began to withdraw, having forgotten the mission details, prompting Nikat to apologize immediately and return to fighting the monsters, while Bella followed to support him. At that moment, Tulsi looked at Chris with a sly glance, whispering that while the majority believed his act, she could see something else in his eyes and knew he was planning something soon, preparing herself for it. Chris was terrified of her, thinking to himself that this girl posed a massive threat to him, calling her terrifying and wishing he were teaching another class. On the other side, Michael and Angelina were in tears and completely devastated. Chris was astonished and asked why they were genuinely crying, especially since Michael and Angelina were the heroes of the story. He questioned their behavior, to which Angelina replied that she was saddened by what he did while they kept fighting without giving up, even when he got eaten. She added that if the monster could have been defeated with a single blow, he should have done so from the start, calling his gamble far too dangerous for them. Chris had no intention of explaining what happened and replied coldly, reiterating what he said before, "Whoever dislikes his methods can leave." However, the truth Chris hid was that the monster actually died of overeating when it tried to swallow him. Chris analyzed the situation, explaining to himself that in this world, monsters do not possess much magic, so they seek it out. Chris possessed a terrifying amount of magical energy, acting like a walking mana reservoir to monsters, making him a highly valuable royal meal. What happened was that Chris's energy was too massive for the monster's body to contain, causing the massive accumulation of mana in a small space to blow the monster apart from within, a quantity of magic the beast had failed to account for. The students finished off the remaining monsters using water magic and ice magic, leaving Chris amazed by their seamless synchronization. Chris then activated his monkey medal, doubling his normal speed. He tried to fight a small rabbit, but it barely escaped his strike. His heart was pounding as he realized his stats were still at F, and he could have died just now. The students successfully cleared 49 out of 50 monsters. Only one was left for Tulsi, but suddenly, the atmosphere turned mysterious as a figure riding a dragon descended from the sky, screaming in disbelief. The figure stated he had his doubts but had finally found him, identifying Chris. This man wore a hood to conceal himself. He revealed himself to be the mastermind behind everything happening here. As he landed in front of Chris, he asked with strange eagerness where he had been and what he had been doing all this time, mentioning it had been a long time since he last saw his beautiful face and how much he had longed to see him. Chris stood stunned before him, completely clueless about who this person was, why he was looking at him that way, and what his connection to the original Chris was. The students were shocked and wanted to know who this terrifying individual was, speaking to their teacher in such a manner. Chris observed him, realizing that his students had definitely misunderstood the situation, as he had absolutely no idea who this man was. The mysterious man looked at him and asked what the matter was, questioning why Chris wasn't happy to see him. He wondered when the original Chris had met this person and where, concluding that there was no use trying to figure it out since he lacked those memories, reminding himself that he simply had to play the role of Chris for now. The man called out to Chris from behind, but Chris didn't respond. When Michael saw Chris's expression, his heart sank and he grew anxious, sensing that this man was extremely dangerous. The terror escalated when the man began treating the monsters as if they were his own little children, leading Michael to suspect that he was the one who unleashed these wild beasts upon them. The mysterious man remarked that he thought someone had killed his pets. Never expecting the genius behind it to be Chris, he continued coldly, stating that the teacher should watch the little show, referring to Michael, indicating that one of his companions would fall right before his eyes. He admitted he hadn't expected the creative way Chris intervened, asking Chris to understand his position as well. The students were horrified upon hearing this, but Chris commanded them to calm down. The mysterious man continued to mock Chris, accusing him of ruining his mission and asking why he remained silent. He then apologized, asking if Chris still remembered the past. Michael observed Chris with suspicion, wondering what he would do, sensing that something unnatural was happening. He sensed that Chris harbored an intense aura, yet remained silent without attacking for their sake. Michael felt a heavy burden of guilt, viewing himself as nothing but a drag on the teacher. The mysterious man continued his dialogue, stating that he was delaying them, but if he could claim Chris's achievements, it would greatly elevate his standing. He kept praising Chris's beautiful face, leaving Michael shocked and unable to comprehend what this individual was talking about, finding his manner of speaking to the teacher incredibly bizarre. Suddenly, Chris drew a sword from his hand and held it against the man's neck. Michael was startled and couldn't comprehend how the sword appeared or where it came from, knowing that only a few people on the continent could utilize such magic. However, since this was teacher Chris, nothing seemed impossible. Chris looked at the man with utter disgust, telling him that he talked too much with foolish, incomprehensible words, demanding that he leave immediately or suffer the consequences. The man became visibly anxious, failing to understand, and asked Chris why he still held a grudge against him over that matter. Internally, Chris was laughing, celebrating that he was saved at the last second because the 50th monster was killed at that exact moment. Chris thanked his luck that a dying monster on the ground was finally finished off, completing the mission, which allowed Michael to officially become a member. The system confirmed the mission's completion, granting him the third part of the map and a spectral sword. The system noted that he could now remove the monkey medal and equip the sword instead. Indeed, Chris drew the rusty sword and held it to the man's neck. The sword possessed the property to cut through anything, though its durability was only 3 out of 3, meaning its usage was strictly limited. Chris silently thanked Michael for saving his life and preserving his dignified reputation. Recognizing the tense atmosphere, the mysterious man told Chris that it seemed they wouldn't be talking today and that he would return at another time, adding that if Chris ever needed assistance, he could contact him through his master. Chris was highly agitated and warned him that he should keep his tongue in check and vanish from his sight immediately. As soon as the intruder left, Chris felt a wave of relief. The students were exhausted. Tulsi had completely depleted her mana and was struggling to catch her breath, while Michael checked on her and Bella to ensure they were all right. The other students began bombarding Chris with questions about the battle. However, Chris refused to answer any of their questions. He looked at Angelina coldly and instructed her to send a messenger to the academy, requesting a horse-drawn carriage for their return. Angelina complied, though she secretly wished he had asked for assistance much earlier. Tulsi remarked slyly that if the teacher had simply utilized teleportation magic, the entire matter would have been resolved in a second. Chris, of course, pretended not to hear a thing, since he possessed no teleportation or any other magic. However, the kind-hearted Michael came to his rescue, telling Tulsi that the teacher was obviously exhausted and wanted to give them an opportunity to reflect on what had occurred. Hearing Michael's words, Chris nearly teared up with joy, thinking to himself that Michael was the only one who truly understood him here. Appreciating his presence in the class, the entirety of Class X returned safely. The following day, Chris was trying to process his new life while investigating the man wrapped in bandages he encountered in the forest. Discovering his identity to be Maria, a dangerous individual who creates chimera monsters, Chris felt a looming disaster approaching. The disaster manifested as a teacher named Eugene, the instructor for Class Y. Eugene was the type of annoying, intrusive character that Chris found unbearable. Chris understood the stakes. The principal, upon learning of the Demon King's army's appearance, suspected Chris of conspiring with them and sent Eugene to spy on him. Chris recognized this as a major predicament. Caught between the principal and the Demon King's army, knowing that if Eugene caught him slipping, he would be doomed, Eugene began pestering Chris, insisting that he should accompany him to lunch as his treat. Chris responded with utter calmness and sharp words, telling him that he was an eyesore and demanding he vanish from his sight. Eugene replied with complete coldness, raising his voice, which surprised the onlookers who always thought he was gentle and quiet. Internally, Eugene wondered what was wrong with Chris. Finding his personality bizarre, as Chris shouted at him to disappear and shut up, Eugene laughed and agreed to drop it, stating he wouldn't push as long as he was around. Chris watched him, reiterating his demand for him to get out of his face because he was annoying. Suddenly, a new mission appeared on the system screen, requiring him to build relationships with the faculty by requesting a joint lesson with another teacher. The reward was a piece of the map and a mandrake root, while the penalty was death. The time limit given was 48 hours. Chris questioned why the system kept hiding its dark intentions, forcing him to accept foolish missions or face death, since Eugene was the perfect target, and considering that most of the students who fled Chris's class had joined Eugene's. Chris decided to use this to ease his mission without causing suspicion, adopting a stern expression. He looked at Eugene and said that because of him, he had wasted 5 minutes of his time, noting that he had paid the price himself. He added that as a teacher, he valued many things, and if anything were to happen to Eugene, he would be upset. Internally, Chris wanted to bury himself out of sheer embarrassment, finding his own improvised script ridiculous. Having just fabricated a tragic backstory on the spot, he then added with immense dignity that he wished to become his friend, suggesting they should compete by comparing the lowlifes Eugene taught against the students Chris was raising to see who was superior. Eugene naturally agreed to the arrangement, intending to monitor Chris and extract information from him, causing the tension between them to skyrocket. Eugene smiled and accepted, calling it an entertaining idea, adding that whoever wins must treat the other to a nice meal. Internally, Chris found it absurd, wondering why this man was so obsessed with food. As every conversation revolved around being treated to a meal, He replied confidently, asking who would realistically win anyway, and they agreed that the confrontation would take place the following day. As Chris walked away, he thought to himself that the outcome didn't matter as long as the joint lesson took place, so the system would leave him alone. Confident that the geniuses in his class wouldn't lose, unbeknownst to them, Nikat was standing nearby, hidden, having overheard the entire conversation and understanding the situation perfectly. Soon, the entire academy was in an uproar. Everyone had heard the news that Class X would face Class Y in a direct battle. They found it surprising, noting that Class X had abandoned their own classroom to confront Class Y, and what was even more shocking was that Eugene had invited teacher Chris out for a meal. When Nikat returned to his classroom after this whirlwind of news, he shouted at his classmates, asking why they were sitting around idly when they heard what happened. Tulsi sat lazily, asking with boredom what he was talking about. Bella mentioned she was hungry and that the winner should just get it over with. Nikat looked at them and announced that they were entering a challenge against Class Y, and if they lost, Eugene would become their class teacher. The entire class was shocked, and some laughed, never expecting such a challenge. Michael's eyes blazed with determination, stating it was impossible to lose since the teacher trusted them, interpreting the challenge as a sign of confidence. He added that Eugene clearly wanted to exploit the situation, so they had to prepare themselves to win. Angelina laughed, telling him to calm down as he was on the verge of losing control. The following day, all the training students gathered in the arena. Chris stood facing Eugene, and the disparity in numbers was massive. Eugene's class was completely full, while Chris had only his 5 students. Eugene asked Chris if he was familiar with the sparring system, explaining it consisted of individual rounds where the first team to score 3 wins would be victorious. Chris replied that the winner would simply halt them, suggesting they shouldn't let the numbers cause a delay and finish it all at once. Chris selected his first fighter, who was naturally Nikat, ordering him to secure a victory. Nikat agreed, acknowledging it as an order. Internally, Chris found Nikat's behavior a bit peculiar since morning, but brushed it off. Nikat faced a girl named Irina Jelly from Class Y. Irina attacked with all her might, her sword gleaming, but Nikat took a deep breath and, in a movement faster than lightning, disarmed her, leaving her on her knees in shock. The referee shouted, declaring Nikat from Class X the winner of the first round, showing great sportsmanship. Nikat ran over to Irina, extended his hand, and asked if she was all right, offering to help her up. The second round began. Chris observed Angelina and was amazed by her magic as she formed ice structures with ease, utilizing rapid and focused movements in her attacks. It didn't take long for Angelina to send her opponent flying to the ground with a single blow, securing their defeat. The referee shouted, announcing Angelina from Class X as the winner. Angelina looked at Chris with a look of seeking approval. Internally, Chris wondered why she was looking at him that way, comparing her expression to a pet that had done something right and was waiting for a reward. He wanted to encourage her, but remembering his role, he snapped at her, asking why she was just standing there and ordering her to return to her spot immediately. Angelina was startled and retreated, composed herself, leaving Class X with 2 victories. They needed just one more victory to conclude the match. Chris called upon Tulsi to finish the matter, but Tulsi suddenly raised her hand and declared her withdrawal without any hesitation. The entire class was shocked, and they hurriedly asked her why, wondering if she was sick or if she intentionally wanted Eugene to win, questioning her strategy. When Chris heard their chatter, he was perplexed, wondering how they even found out about the wager between him and Eugene. Tulsi laughed with a mysterious smile, stating that a one-on-one confrontation didn't feel fair to her. Chris suspected she harbored a secret nobody knew, as her presence within the hero team felt unique and her current speed was remarkably high. Tulsi looked at Michael and told him slyly to take her place and crush their opponent. Michael stepped into the arena with absolute determination, eager to prove himself to the teacher. However, the shock came from his opponent, who was the Academy's notorious bully and arrogant individual full of himself. The moment he saw Michael, he began insulting him, calling him a despicable servant and stating he should be grateful just to face him. Chris was shocked upon seeing the bully's face, realizing this was a disaster, having forgotten that the game included typical thug characters meant to antagonize the protagonist. Michael remained silent and didn't reply, which prompted the bully to strike where it hurt most. calling him a wretched orphan who came to the academy after causing his mother's death. At that exact moment, Michael snapped. His expression changed completely as an intense rage triggered a severe headache. Chris's heart began to race, knowing that ever since Michael woke up from his previous comatose state, his energy had become unnatural. This wasn't a normal awakening, but rather the demon inside him waking up. Michael gritted his teeth, his eyes turning terrifying as he glared at the bully, uttering in a strange voice that he should flee and die right now. One of the standing teachers asked if Michael was all right, but Chris knew it was already too late. Michael was entering a state of berserk rage, and if the demon within took control, the entire arena would turn into a slaughterhouse in seconds. The foolish bully, failing to grasp the magnitude of the catastrophe he had unleashed, continued to mock Michael until Michael finished him off with a single blow. Chris felt his nerves shattering, realizing the situation had spun completely out of control and that he needed to execute some serious role-playing right now. Chris shouted at the top of his lungs in the arena, declaring that the match was over. Unfortunately, it was too late. A terrifying dark energy began to emanate from Michael's body, spreading straight into the atmosphere. The students stood frozen in sheer terror, and Chris's face turned pale with fear, realizing Michael had truly transformed into a monster. The entire arena erupted into screams that a monster had appeared. The bully who was tormenting him moments ago was now trembling, begging and pleading for help, stating he didn't want to die here at his hands. At that moment, the system intervened, presenting Chris with a new mission: to calm the protagonist with his own hands. Chris was furious, noting that the system constantly threw impossible demands at him. Eugene tried to intervene, deploying magical binding lines around Michael, but Michael snapped them like mere threads, sending Eugene flying into the air with a single strike. The teachers screamed, ordering everyone to retreat, noting that magic was completely ineffective against him. The instructors shouted at Chris, urging him to run quickly. Chris remained unfazed, walking forward with absolute confidence through the dark energy. As Michael reached the peak of his frenzy, his eyes met Chris's, and a small fragment of his consciousness surfaced, pleading with Chris to leave so he wouldn't get hurt. Chris took a deep breath, thinking to himself that he had almost broken character out of pure terror. But looking at Michael, he realized this was his chance. Without uttering a single word, Chris approached Michael with a fearless expression and suddenly lunged, striking Michael with his knee and forcing him to the ground. Holding him firmly by his clothes, Chris leaned in and asked calmly yet firmly if this was the power he truly desired. He told him that regardless of what fate had written, if he possessed true will, he could be reborn and become truly strong, reminding him that he had told him not to become a monster, reiterating it so he would return to his normal state. These words hit Michael like a lightning bolt. The dark fog clouding his eyes began to vanish, and his consciousness returned to normal. Chris let go of him, looked at his students with utter calmness, and instructed them to move back to their classroom. They walked away, leaving everyone standing in disbelief that this terrifying teacher managed to tame a demon with just a few words, concluding that he was a truly marvelous individual. Following the conclusion of the battle, Chris found himself alone, his head still spinning from everything that had transpired. Suddenly, he felt a sharp, severe pain in his side, causing him to bend over in agony. Holding his stomach, he noted how incredibly painful it was, convinced that he might actually die from it. Amidst the intense pain, the system's chime rang out, displaying a screen that confirmed the mission's completion. His rewards included a portion of the academy, the fourth part of the map, a mandrake route, and the activation of the map's tracking feature. The system informed him that he could also utilize the mandrake route to increase his reputation by 200%. With that, the first chapter of the story concluded. Chris sighed with relief, glad to have survived the crisis, noting that while he hated being entangled with these fools, he at least managed to escape with some rewards. Concluding that the academy portion and the tracking feature would be highly useful. However, Chris was still worried about Michael, so he went to the infirmary and began observing what was happening through the back door. His heart was pounding, but he tried to maintain his composure, thinking to himself that he shouldn't interfere in anyone else's business, though he acknowledged that the boy suffered from deep-seated trauma. As he prepared to leave, he heard a gentle voice from inside the room, causing him to startle. The voice stated it knew he would come to visit them, calling him a truly kind person and inviting him to enter. Chris was shocked upon recognizing the voice. He entered, to find them waiting with a slight smile. Chris snapped at him, attempting to hide his concern, telling him that what he did was incredibly reckless and that he could have died. Eugene laughed and asked if Chris had noticed his recklessness. Chris recalled the moment Eugene threw himself to protect Michael without utilizing any defensive magic, looking at him with disdain. Chris thought to himself that this boy was incredibly foolish for throwing his body out there without any protection. It was as if Eugene had read his thoughts. Eugene looked at Chris, trying to ease his worries by telling him not to fret, as he had been absolutely certain that Chris would not die. He added that if this ordeal meant Chris would owe him a favor, then it was a simple matter indeed. Eugene then asked about their wager and what they should do next, pointing out that technically, Class X had won more rounds. Chris glanced at him and remarked that it was glaringly obvious Eugene had lost. Eugene began to act as if he were deep in thought before bursting into laughter, suggesting that he treat Chris to breakfast to celebrate his victory. Chris observed him closely and asked if he had already forgotten the terms of their wager. Eugene playfully deflected, stating that having just survived a major accident, he might be suffering from physical trauma, making it highly probable that he simply forgot. Left with no patience for him, Chris walked away, muttering to himself that he was completely done talking to that annoying man. Eugene called after him with a laugh, stating that this was a personal invitation and he would be waiting for Chris's response at any time. He also told Chris that he could count on him for any service, as it was the least he could do to alleviate the exhaustion and hardship Chris had endured. Chris thought to himself that this foolish man spoke in a very peculiar manner, especially with how things had escalated. Suddenly, the system chimed again, announcing the beginning of the second chapter. The system informed Chris that the narrative path would branch based on his choice, prompting him to select the route he desired. 3 paths appeared on the screen before him. The first was the Demon King's path, where Chris would act as a spy for the Demon King, and his mission would be to convince Michael to join the forces of evil to conquer the world. The second was the Holy Emperor's path, where he would oppose the Demon King, foster new talents, and his mission would be to make Michael swear absolute loyalty to the Emperor, thereby preventing the Demon King's return. The third path was neglect, meaning he would choose none of the above options. The system issued a stern warning, stating that any hesitation would make everyone hate him and he would find no allies, as both the demons and the warriors would become his sworn enemies. Chris began to evaluate his choices with growing anxiety. He thought that choosing the Emperor's path would force him to deal with crazy fanatics, which he preferred to avoid, while choosing the Demon King's path would pit him directly against Eugene. In truth, he detested both factions and had no desire to involve himself with either. After deep deliberation, Chris pressed the third option. Deciding not to choose either side, the system immediately responded, confirming that he had successfully chosen his path and explicitly stating that there was absolutely no turning back from this decision. Taking a deep breath, Chris murmured that he was already satisfied with this choice, as his primary goal was his own survival. The following day, Chris sat in his room, completely bewildered. He questioned himself, wondering why he was the one being driven out of his job if the true protagonist was someone else. To understand how things had reached this point, the events traced back to the previous day. One of the Academy staff members had called out to Chris, mentioning she heard a rumor that he would be taking a leave of absence starting tomorrow. Asking if it was true that the principal had granted him a month-long vacation and ordered Class X to take his place, Chris had been utterly shocked, demanding to know what she was talking about. His status screen materialized before him, revealing the true reason behind this forced leave. Despite always doing whatever he pleased, the side characters aligned with the Holy Empire had begun to harbor deep suspicions about him. Looking closely at his status window, he confirmed that his path was registered as none selected. His fame stood at a mere 10, and the prevailing rumor about him was that he was a strange and highly suspicious individual. Chris found it baffling. The system had warned him that people would suspect him, but he believed the complications of the other 2 paths would have been far greater. By nature, Chris was a mysterious character whose true thoughts were impossible to decipher, but he had never imagined they would throw him out of the academy like this. He reassured himself that choosing the original Demon King's path was completely out of the question. and the word loyalty in the Emperor's path genuinely unnerved him. Given how filled with lunatics this novel was, he tried to comfort himself with the thought of enjoying a month-long vacation. Suddenly, a system notification popped up, asking if he was aware that the parents' visitation day was rapidly approaching. The system noted that parents wanted to see exactly where their money was going, and since a teacher's livelihood depended on their funding, Chris had to succeed on that day. The penalty for failure was death within 72 hours. Terrified, Chris clutched his head, wondering if the system was playing a sick joke on him. Completely unaware of the nightmare he was trapped in, realizing that hard work was now mandatory and that the students' parents would soon arrive, Chris's demeanor shifted instantly. Filled with grim determination, he declared that his vacation was cut short and he had to return to work before the 72-hour deadline expired. Meanwhile, the students of Class X were sitting together. Bella looked around in bewilderment, asking if Teacher Chris was truly on leave. Tulsi tilted her head, explaining that the principal was currently setting a date to assign a temporary instructor for their class, though she didn't know the exact reason. Tulsi then laughed mischievously, suggesting that Chris had undoubtedly grown tired of them and fled, since teaching wasn't his primary concern anyway. Angelina glared at her angrily, telling her to shut up and stating it was wrong to speak ill of someone who wasn't there to defend himself. Michael chuckled, pointing out the hypocrisy, since Angelina looked incredibly distressed herself, as if she were on the verge of tears. Angelina snapped back defensively, asking what was wrong with her face and insisting she was speaking perfectly normally, attempting to ease the tension. Nikat suggested that Chris might simply need some rest, or that something beyond his control had occurred. He stood up and added that the teacher had taken full responsibility for what happened in the forest, which was why he was temporarily suspended. Bella quickly slapped Nikat's shoulder to silence him and forced him back into his seat. Michael remained unusually quiet and composed, reflecting deeply on the past events. He acknowledged to himself that his sudden rampage and loss of control had caused a massive crisis for Teacher Chris. He realized that the teacher had taken the blame to protect him. Recalling Chris's words about how anyone with true will could be reborn as a hero, Michael felt a pang of guilt, realizing he hadn't even thanked him yet, and knew he had to do something to rectify this. Suddenly, Tulsi shouted with absolute certainty, declaring that they would bring Teacher Chris back, regardless of what anyone else said. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Nikat ran hurriedly toward the staff room. He burst through the door and addressed the temporary teacher, stating that the matter was extremely urgent and he needed to know if the principal's message had arrived. The teacher sighed in exasperation, asking how many times she had to tell him that her name wasn't pronounced that way. Nikat cut her off impatiently, shouting that there was no time to discuss her name because his friend, Michael, had completely lost control of his powers. The teacher put her hands on her head in despair, wondering how many times this was going to happen and complaining about her workload. She muttered that even though these students came from incredibly wealthy families, they never listened to rules, assuming that another monster had manifested. When they arrived at the classroom, the teacher stood before Michael, who had begun putting on an elaborate act, claiming that something dangerous was erupting inside him. Tulsi seamlessly joined the drama, grabbing Michael and pleading with him, telling him he needed to show more passion and urging him to take off his jacket to make the performance look more realistic. Bella stepped in quickly, telling the teacher not to be alarmed and suggesting they take Michael to a hotel to be treated. Their true motive was to turn the classroom into an absolute chaotic mess, thereby proving to everyone that no one could control Michael or put an end to his monstrous outbursts, except for Teacher Chris. The temporary teacher stood watching Michael and the rest of the students, realizing in amusement that their acting performance was utterly pathetic. She called out to Michael coldly, informing him that whenever a student lost control of their mana, an emergency warning spell would immediately alert Eugene. She noted with a smirk that no such alert had been triggered, meaning absolutely nothing was wrong. Embarrassed and exposed, Michael fell silent and apologized to her. However, Nikat refused to back down. He leaned in and whispered to Michael, reminding him that Professor Chris was the only one capable of calming him down, urging him to surrender completely to the act so the teacher would be forced to return. He stressed that the plan must not fail, warning Michael that if he didn't fake losing control right now, they wouldn't be able to pull it off. Tulsi was seething with frustration internally. grumbling about how everyone kept talking about nothing but Chris. She wondered what was so wonderful about that man to make them love him this much, reminding herself that she only had to endure this circus until Parents' Day, after which she would graduate, cut ties with these wealthy, troublesome kids, and be perfectly fine, unbeknownst to the temporary teacher. This failed performance was only the beginning, as the students were already plotting a far greater scheme. In a completely different location, Chris had sought refuge in a local tavern. The tavern owner was busy cleaning, keeping a terrified eye on Chris. The owner had run this establishment for 50 years and had never encountered a customer like him. At first, he assumed Chris was just a regular traveler, but Chris had been sitting there for 3 hours with a stern expression, doing nothing but talking to himself. The atmosphere around Chris was so heavy and oppressive that other patrons refused to go near him, whispering among themselves whether he was a demon or something sinister. The owner desperately wanted to kick him out, but was too terrified of having his tavern destroyed. Suddenly, a new customer entered. The owner prepared to welcome him, but froze in sheer terror upon recognizing Duke Sheriff, Angelina's father. The owner's dread intensified when Natasha, Nikat's mother, walked in right behind him. Natasha was shouting loudly, telling the Duke that she had explicitly asked him not to remove the hood concealing his face. The entire tavern fell dead silent the moment they appeared, paralyzed with fear. Duke Sheriff replied with utter coldness, stating that no one here knew who he was anyway, and that he hadn't done anything wrong. Natasha laughed mockingly, retorting that there wasn't a single soul in the entire kingdom who wouldn't recognize him, calling him the most conspicuous person in the land, and demanding he cover his face. Before their bickering could continue, a harsh, booming voice cut them off, stating that their absolute priority should be booking a room rather than arguing. The speaker was Henry Bright, Tulsa's father, a short man with striking red hair. Henry asked the tavern owner how much 3 vacant rooms would cost, wondering if he would accept 3 high-tier magic crystals as payment. He explained that he had been imprisoned in a magic tower for 80 years and was completely out of touch with current currency values. The tavern owner stood in absolute shock, as 3 high-tier magic crystals were valuable enough to purchase every single tavern in the entire country. Suddenly, Natasha's gaze locked onto the corner where Chris was sitting. Sensing something deeply unsettling, she drew her sword with extreme caution and pressed the blade directly against Chris's neck, demanding to know his identity. Henry noted that Chris possessed a terrifying bloodlust that had been radiating through the room for a while, asking if he was there on a mission. The tavern owner looked as though he was about to faint from fright, but Chris remained incredibly calm, with a chilling voice. Chris muttered for them to get their faces out of his sight, unless they wanted their heads smashed. Natasha laughed, asking if he was seriously threatening her, and wondered aloud whose head would actually roll first. The tavern owner silently prayed that he could just close down his business and retire safely. Internally, however, Chris's hand was trembling violently as he gripped his bottle. He was cursing his luck, realizing that all he wanted was to escape a cockroach in his room and drink in peace, only for this nightmare to unfold. The terrifying implications of the situation dawned on him as he recalled the gathering of the executioners. He realized these powerful figures would never recognize him in his current state, so he had tried to hide in the dark corner to avoid them. Yet, Natasha had pinned him down, complaining that his terrifying aura was suffocating the entire room. She demanded to know why Chris didn't draw his weapon, asking if his sword was merely for decoration. Chris thought to himself that this was a critical moment. His spectral sword could only be drawn 3 times in total before breaking, and he could not afford to waste a single charge now. However, he quickly realized that since she was a knight, she would not strike first as long as he refrained from attacking, meaning he shouldn't provoke her rashly. Looking at her with complete nonchalance, Chris took a sip of his drink and remarked that this juice was better than anything in the Red Kingdom. He added that if he were to draw his sword now, the entire area would be completely obliterated, meaning no one would ever get to taste this juice again, which would be a tragic loss for everyone. He took another sip, pondering to himself that if the owner kept selling this high-quality drink at such a cheap price, he would surely go bankrupt by next week. Natasha burst into a cynical laugh, calling him an eccentric man, and admitting she never expected him to care so much about the future of this tavern. She sheathed her sword and apologized for her rash behavior, introducing herself as Natasha, the newly appointed Red Knight of the Empire. Chris noticed a distinct shift in her tone as she began to complain to him, stating that true weakness lay in knights who put the lives of citizens at risk under the pretext of protecting them. To make amends, she promised the tavern owner that she would purchase every single bottle of juice in the establishment. Turning back to Chris, she stated there was an important matter they needed to discuss. Duke Sheriff approached them, and Chris sat silently, convinced that his end had come and this endless nightmare would never cease. The three powerful figures gathered around his table. Sheriff looked at them and noted that they had only poured water, asking if they truly intended to carry out their plan. He raised his glass, suggesting that celebrating with the tavern's juice was far better than the water of their own kingdom. And they all joined in the drink. After a few tense moments, Chris stared into his glass, silently praying for someone to rescue him from these lunatics who seemed capable of killing him. As he prepared to slide away and return to his room, Natasha stopped him, stating she knew he was headed back to the academy. She commanded him to pack his bags immediately because they would all be traveling together as a group. Duke Sheriff intervened, explaining that they weren't traveling merely for the parents' visitation day. The true reason was that they wanted to personally investigate the monster that had appeared at the academy, having heard rumors about a student transforming into a beast and attacking a teacher. Chris swallowed hard, terrified that his previous acting performance had been far too convincing. Duke Sheriff leaned closer, his face etched with genuine concern regarding the control of such power. Chris felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, feeling as though he were being abducted in broad daylight. As they prepared to depart for their grand destination, Henry remarked cheerfully that pleasant conversation really made the time fly, expressing his happiness at their companionship. Chris, conversely, was furious, certain that Natasha was the only one doing any talking. Upon arriving at the academy grounds, something suddenly lunged out from the surrounding trees. Guided by pure survival instinct, Chris pulled his hand back from the ground and braced himself for an impact. Natasha caught him, asking if he was all right. In that exact moment, frantic shouts echoed from the distance as students called out for their teacher. Before anyone could move, Nikat's long sword clashed directly against Natasha's armor. Chris watched in absolute shock, unable to believe that Nikat was actually there, wielding his weapon with such speed. Natasha looked at her son in surprise, admitting she thought this area was an ambush. But seeing his swift reflexes, she smiled. Realizing he had truly grown strong, Nikat stood tense, gripping his sword tightly, demanding to know why she was attempting to kidnap their teacher. Chris remained entirely speechless. Natasha was still holding onto him, and Chris realized his cover was completely blown. Nikat genuinely believed his teacher was being abducted, and worse, the rest of the students might witness this chaos. The students had arrived at the campus early, and were now rushing toward them, shouting and charging forward to defend Chris. Angelina cried out in immense relief, stating she had always believed in him, and knew he would never be intimidated. Chris sighed in relief, realizing the students had actually jumped over the academy walls to follow and watch over them. He demanded an explanation for their reckless behavior. His gaze shifted to Michael, who flinched nervously the moment his name was uttered. Stuttering, Michael explained they believed teacher Chris had abandoned them, which was why they came to apologize, thank him, and see him one last time. Even if he never returned to the academy, Chris observed them, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. Even though these students were technically strangers to him, their fierce loyalty made him want to become a better person for them. He quickly masked his emotion with anger, snapping that they were nothing but a source of constant headaches, before raising his hand and ordering them all to return to the academy. To his surprise, his suspension was completely overturned. Inside the grand hall, the three parents stood within the principal's office, confronting Principal Lily. Lily asked them in trepidation why they were so fiercely opposing the suspension of teacher Chris, considering he had only been appointed a few days ago. Henry responded firmly, stating that Chris was the only instructor capable of properly guiding Tulsi, and concluded that the academy's judgment was entirely flawed. Duke Sheriff added that an individual of Chris's caliber was an exceedingly rare talent, even among their prestigious bloodlines. Insisting he must return to his duties immediately, following the intense pressure applied by the parents on the principal, Chris returned to the academy. Realizing that whether they were praising him or merely flattery, he was now bound to his role. He stood before his quiet classroom, feeling as though he had just signed a judicial decree sentencing him to life imprisonment. He began writing his lesson notes on the blackboard while Natasha watched from the back, highly impressed, noting that he was clearly employing an advanced, unconventional method of education. Henry agreed, remarking that Chris was utilizing Eastern meditation techniques, adding that he had heard great praise regarding his teaching style. Duke Sheriff watched in silence, admitting that while he didn't fully comprehend it, it was undoubtedly a unique approach. Chris glanced back at the classroom, heavily weighed down by the realization that these students were now his absolute responsibility, requiring a massive investment of his time and a constant need to maintain his flawless persona. Duke Sheriff sat relaxed, his expression serene, but Chris knew better. He recognized the Duke as the dangerous mastermind responsible for shaping Angelina into the perfect, flawless lady of the academy, making him a highly volatile threat. Suddenly, Angelina raised her hand and asked if she could be excused to go to the restroom. Chris granted her permission. As she stood up, however, she began to stumble and breathe with great difficulty. Michael rushed forward, extending his hand to steady her, anxiously asking if she was all right. Duke Sheriff watched the scene unfold in profound silence. Realizing this was the very first time he had ever seen his daughter display such vulnerability, as she had always maintained a perfectly composed demeanor, Chris quickly intervened, instructing Angelina to go and rest immediately. Internally, he worried that she was on the verge of collapsing again. A short while later, as Chris walked down the hallway, Natasha called out to him, asking where he was going and wondering if he was simply going to abandon their guests. Chris replied coldly that the class had concluded and there was nothing left for them to see, before closing the doors and exiting the area. Henry watched him leave, murmuring that it was rather disappointing. Duke Sheriff remained silent, while Natasha simply suggested they go grab a drink. Complaining that she was both hungry and thirsty, Chris eventually reached the secluded spot where Angelina had gone, overhearing her crying softly. It was clear she had sought out this quiet corner to have some privacy. Suddenly, the system screen materialized before his eyes, announcing the successful completion of his hidden objective and prompting him to select his reward. The available rewards began cycling across the screen: the Frozen Warrior's armor, the Succubus defense skill, or the most popular man's blessing. Chris stared at the options in sheer bewilderment, finding these rewards to be incredibly absurd. Guided by his survival instincts, he dismissed the screen, muttering that none of this mattered right now and that he needed to deal with the situation at hand. He stepped into the room to find Angelina leaning against the desk, her shoulders trembling violently and her eyes brimming with tears. Chris calmly addressed her by her true name, Dan Sheriff. Angelina gasped in absolute shock, her fragile composure shattering instantly. She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, demanding to know how he could possibly know that name. Chris observed her, realizing that his deductions were entirely correct and that the reality of this world perfectly mirrored the lore of the original novel. In truth, Angelina was actually born as a male named Mariadanti. He was a naturally gifted individual within the Sheriff bloodline, but after his talented sister mysteriously vanished, his father chose him to take her place. Through brutal training, cruelty, and extensive brainwashing, he was molded into the perfect Angelina his father desperately desired. In the original novel, this shocking revelation had completely derailed the plot, triggering massive outrage among the readers, many of whom claimed the author had lost his mind. While some fans resigned from the fandom, others welcomed the dark twist, arguing it added profound depth to the character. Dan Sheriff was actually an illegitimate child of average strength who had been utterly neglected by the Duke. When the true Angelina disappeared, the Duke didn't bother searching for her. Instead, he used advanced magic to halt Dan's physical growth and subjected him to severe brainwashing, leaving permanent psychological trauma in his mind. According to the story's lore, this had resulted in a severe mental affliction. Trembling in the hallway, Dante began to desperately beg Chris, weeping that if his father ever discovered the truth, Chris would be made to disappear just like the ones before him. Chris vividly recalled the terrifying reality that Duke Sheriff had ruthlessly silenced anyone who ever uncovered the truth about Dante. Facing the terrified youth, Chris adopted a fearless gaze and asked calmly if he truly looked like someone weak enough to be easily manipulated or threatened. Dante fell silent, a faint, trembling smile appearing on his face as Chris began to formulate a strategic plan. Chris recognized that the Sheriff House was one of the powerful neutral factions that had refused to pledge allegiance to either the Demon King or the Holy Emperor. If Chris wanted to survive in this treacherous world, he desperately needed a powerful insurance policy. Looking intently at Dante, Chris pronounced his true name clearly once more, stating that he needed him. Dante, utterly terrified for his own life, continued to plead with Chris to call her Angelina. Stepping flawlessly into his role as the strict yet deeply perceptive mentor, Chris addressed him with a mix of stern authority and hidden reassurance. He informed Dante that he would be the one to lead Class X to absolute victory in the upcoming Academy tournament. This was the core of Chris's master plan. By ensuring their victory, he would place these powerful students and their influential families firmly in his debt, which was the fastest and safest route to securing his own protection. Utilizing his absolute knowledge of the novel's future events, he intended to win them over completely. Chris promised Dante that if he executed his instructions flawlessly, he would personally uncover the mystery behind the true Angelina's disappearance and bring her back, thereby ending the horrific nightmare Dante was currently trapped in. With that profound vow, the summary of the second part draws to a close.